Welcome to WCIV1. We're going to start as early in the beginning of Western civilization as possible, starting with discussion of early human ancestors, and we will get to about 1715-ish in this class. Humans are part of a taxonomic family of primates, and there are certain traits that are very specific to human beings, and the biggest one among them is the location of the spine underneath the skull. So if you look at the blue line in the illustration, that shows the more or less position of the spine to each one of these different skeletons. And when you look at the human on the far right hand side there, the line of the spine is almost directly underneath the bottom of the skull. It lines up perfectly with the what's called the foramen magnum. That's the hole in the bottom of your skull, and it indicates to anyone studying this that because the spine is more or less straight up and down, that you've got an animal that walks upright. We're talking two-legged bipedal locomotion, walking upright. There's also a reduction in prognathism in the skulls, and that's just a fancy way of saying that what you have are skulls where the bottom jaw juts out further than the face, and you can see it's an extreme example on the left, and then not so much in the middle, and then humans, their faces are almost completely flat. And so these are traits that are developed over millions of years, but they're all shared by members in this family. This photograph is a special place in human history. This is where some of the earliest fossils of hominids were found. It's Olduvai Gorge. It's in extreme eastern Africa. And some of the fossils that we found here, we don't even completely understand exactly what we have, but the later species of genus Homo are well represented in the fossil record here. And this just happens to be a place where this specific layer of rock for this time period is exposed at the ground level. So it's very easy for paleontologists and archaeologists to go in there and extract this material and find things. And beginning in 1959, 1960, scientists began to find some of the more complete specimens of these early hominids that have still been found to this day. In terms of these fossil discoveries, this is probably the most famous name that you'll ever hear. This is Louis Leakey, and in 1959, 1960, he was the one making the biggest discoveries, finding the greatest, basically treasure trove of these fossils, and overnight he becomes a household name, kind of the front of the newspaper kind of personality, and he goes on for years and years and years to go all over eastern Africa collecting these fossils and making even greater, enabling us to fill in greater sections of the history of hominid and then later human evolution. And this is probably the most famous specimen to have been discovered in eastern Africa. Was found in 1974 in northern Ethiopia. This is nicknamed Lucy, and I want to be very clear that you're seeing these artist representations, these kind of sculptures of these creatures. They're based upon measurements from the actual skeletal remains. We don't know exactly what their face looked like, whether they were smiling and parted their hair in a certain way, etc., etc. So with these illustrations, and you're going to see some more coming up, we don't know exactly all of the information in terms of their eye color and things of that nature. There's a little bit of artistic license going on here, but I can actually vouch for this set of fossils. I've actually seen it in the museum, and believe it or not, that skeleton you see on the left hand side is just about 3 feet tall, and it's probably the most complete specimen of Australopithecus that has been found. And this is going way back. The basic ancestor of hominids themselves. Now, one thing to look at on the right-hand side there is the pronounced prognathic jaw that creature has. You can see how far out that bottom jaw sticks in relationship to the face and the forehead. Following along later, after the Lucy-type creatures, you get the evolution of this particular animal. It's Homo erectus, Homo being the genus that humans are included in, and erectus meaning this is an animal that is standing upright. Its spine has moved more or less underneath the skull. It's still kind of hunched forward. It's not a anatomically modern human being, but it's beginning to move in that direction. And this happens to be the first one of the genus that has more or less human body proportions, meaning it's not a 3-foot tall creature that sometimes still walks on all fours. It's an upright creature about the same size as you or me. This particular group was the first to figure out tool use, and I'm not talking about DeWalt power drills or anything like that. We're talking about stone tools and the ability to reshape pieces of antler into awls and things like that. This is also the first to have known fire use, maybe for cooking or for light, etc., etc. But we have found their sites and we can document they were the first with tools and fire. This is also the first species to move off of the continent of Africa, and they're found all over the place, especially in Asia, and not so much in Europe. But you also have to remember that Europe, if you look at a map, is very far north, and there's a lot of climactic things going on in the Earth 1.5 million years ago that are going to prevent these creatures from moving out into those areas. Well, this is Homo habilis. It's more or less around the same time as Homo erectus, but their skeletal structure is a little bit different enough for us to be able to tell them apart. We find evidence of Homo habilis in sites much further back than Homo erectus, by the nature of almost 1 million years older. Habilis was it's absolutely clear from the fossil record that Homo habilis was a tool user and was an expert in tool creation, flaking, and making of stone tools. Homo habilis was also another one of the species that was discovered by Louis Leakey, and this is again on another one of his field expeditions. This one happened to be in 1960 to about 1963. This is Homo Neanderthal. I'm certain that you've heard this phrase used as an insult against somebody. This is your quintessential caveman. You've all seen the commercials that show the kind of lumbering, hairy guy dragging his knuckles on the ground. That's supposed to be the caricature of the Neanderthal. And believe it or not, there's actually quite a bit of similarity between Homo Neanderthal and Homo sapiens, modern human beings, enough that there's some blurring of the lines between who is the first kind of modern human. Homo Neanderthal is found extensively in Europe. This also gives rise to this whole idea of the caveman, and we find their fossil sites dating back 400,000 years, some of them to 40,000 years, and they're pretty successful. And if you look at that artist rendering on the right-hand side, you can see where you're beginning to get a lot of similar anatomical structures to modern humans, especially in the face and the brow line and things of that nature. And if you were to pass this guy in a dark alley somewhere, you would probably not think twice about him not being a modern human being. Neanderthals are actually very special. They have an extremely sophisticated material and symbolic culture, and this is something that we don't find anywhere previously in the fossil record at any of these sites. So they are tool users as well, but they're creating extremely precise and specific tools. This is also the first time we see any evidence of clothing in amongst any of these creatures. And when you start manufacturing clothing, you have to have very precise, specific equipment to do so. So you would have to be able to create punches and needles enough to work with leather out of antlers and deer bone and things of that nature. So they've got very, very specific tools for very specific jobs. There's also evidence that they cared for members of their group that were injured. You can see in the artist rendering there, the guy kind of on the middle left has got no arm, but he's not been shunned or eaten, as it were, but he's still part of the group. In addition to clothes, we also have very good fossil sites with burials and a lot of the things that they put into the burials. And the burials that we've found are usually full of all kind of interesting grave goods, beads and little bits of material culture that they're actually putting into a grave and burying with somebody. And this indicates that there's either some kind of mourning going on, or there's some kind of specific importance of death. There's some kind of a ritual culture that is associated with it, and this is also the first time this is seen anywhere in the fossil record. Homo neanderthal may have had a spoken language. This is something that is not going to fossilize and is not going to come down in the fossil record, so it's just conjecture, but more or less it should have been physically able to do this. And there's actually several scientists and historians right now that are having at each other in the academic journals as to whether or not Neanderthal could speak or just grunt. Also from the burials, there's evidence that their society, or at least between their groups, maybe I shouldn't use the word society, but between each little band, each little group of the Neanderthals, there was evidence of lots and lots of violence. And you can see that pretty clearly in the skeletons when they're excavated by archaeologists or historians. So the comparison between Neanderthal and modern human gets a little more tricky here, because a lot of people have asked if there is the potential for there to be two types of humans coexisting for a brief period on the planet at the same time. And if you look at them in this way, basically Neanderthals and modern humans are essentially equivalent in basic proportions. Neanderthals tended to be shorter and heavier, think a little bit stockier, and the fossil evidence proves that they existed on Earth at the same time. So this begs a question, really, of where they went. Modern humans are doing pretty well, so why shouldn't Neanderthals be around at the same time? And there's much argument between historians as to whether they were just simply outcompeted for resources. Modern humans killed them. Modern humans ate them. We interbred with them and just destroyed them genetically. There are sites recently discovered that show the possibility of mixed modern human and Neanderthal groups living at the same site, so that could be, potential inbreeding going on, or excuse me, not inbreeding, but interbreeding between groups. So this is more of a philosophical question, and again, the big question of what is human might come into play here. But for whatever explanation you want to pick, for some reason modern humans simply just passed Neanderthals and continued to survive as a species to this day, while Neanderthals kind of passed into time. This is a great photo illustrating in skeletal structure what I was just talking about. You can see the Neanderthal skull on the right hand side there is much more robust. It's clearly stronger. The brow ridge is heavier. The jaw itself is much heavier. So it's a little bit more stocky and robust creature in terms of skeletal structure. But for whatever reason, incidentally, just by volume, the Neanderthal would have had a much larger brain than the modern human as well. So all of the ideas we have of the caveman being stupid and everything else may not have been entirely true if you just look at brain size, because they would have had a larger brain than a modern human. But for whatever reason, Homo sapiens, modern human, just simply outclasses the Neanderthal. And that brings us to us, modern humans, Homo sapiens. Um, Anatomically, skeletal modern humans began to show up in the fossil record approximately 200,000 years ago. And this is really when the story we started of Western civilization begins to pick up speed, exponentially actually, as we move forward. And Homo sapiens is unique above everything else. As a species, we are extremely intelligent, extremely adaptable, and not only that, but very imaginative. And this shows itself in terms of violence and artistry and things like that that haven't been observed in the fossil record at quite the scale before. So, in 1940, in a cave in Lascaux, France, they discovered these beautiful artistic renderings done by humans in these caves. And these drawings are about 15,000 years old. So you can tell that human beings can conceptualize the world around them enough that they can represent these things on the wall. And this is something that no other hominid had done before. And I would argue that part of the reason that humans outclassed and eventually destroyed the existence of Neanderthals is simply that we, as a species, human beings, may have had more imagination, the ability to look at the world in different ways and be curious about it enough to use that extreme intelligence and adaptability. And it's a double-edged sword, you know. It can create a problem if your imagination and your ingenuity leads you to create a new weapon or something like that, or it always can have a disastrous side, but then again, there's also this beautiful artistic side at the same time. You think about all of the music and art that humans have created, but also we're the species that created the atomic bomb. So there's of course no evidence to support this. I just happen to firmly believe that one of the things that we had over the Neanderthal was an extremely vivid imagination. After modern humans come on the scene, there is an explosion of artistic substance, and you can see this across the board. So these figures, which are called by the archaeologist Venus figures, are found in all different parts of Europe, literally from one side of Europe to the other. And you can see that there's all different types of material. There's stone and wood and ivory being represented here. There's tremendous sophistication in terms of creating these artifacts. And the argument over whether it has religious significance or whether it has political significance doesn't matter as much as the fact that nothing like this had been seen before in the fossil record. And it's clear that the significance here is the human ability to conceptualize the world around us and to translate that into these types of objects. Now, the dates here are ish dates. They're more or less dates. There's nothing exact about this. Nothing comes with a timestamp this far back in human history. But these items, these figures, are being created 21,000 years before the first civilizations, the big civilizations that we find in Mesopotamia. So from the very beginning of human civilization, we've been creating things and modifying the world around us. Civilization, a capital C underlined civilization, really starts first in some of the easiest places for humans to get a foothold in the environment. And basically, we're talking about Mesopotamia, and I'm sure that you've heard that word before, but we're talking about areas like modern-day Iraq, the Mediterranean coast, and then down into the Nile River Valley. For these really early civilizations, there's a little bit of a double-edged sword going on, because the easiest places for them to settle and to grow civilization around themselves are actually some of the worst areas environmentally on the planet. But these river valleys have got water going through them, and there's a thin band along the rivers where there's fertile soil and animals, and they can exploit these natural resources to keep themselves alive. So you can see in this photograph here, there's a river running through that valley, and the water has enabled plants to grow in a otherwise totally depleted environment, and you've got this thin ribbon of greenery going through this basically almost like a moonscape of just rocks and sand and desert. Now, there's two names you absolutely have to know, and they're the major rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates. These run through the middle of what is Iraq today, and they're essentially, these two rivers are parallel to each other. But it is here, between and around these two rivers, that civilization gets its first kind of toehold and then begins to expand outward. Humans are pretty clever, and one of the things they do is they begin a rudimentary system of irrigation. And people begin to dig ditches, and they move water around to places that didn't have it before. And this allows them to expand the area from that little thin strip of green into productive farmland. Now, we are not talking about Roman aqueducts or giant reservoirs with hydroelectric dams and things like that. This is extremely crude and primitive, but it's also effective. And these irrigation systems are designed to harness the natural cycles of rain and nature to allow crops to grow and to irrigate whole parts of the desert. Now, simultaneously, while humans are growing food and they're expanding their knowledge of irrigation, there's beginning a very primitive form of domestication that starts. And domestication is a pretty specific activity where animals are bred consciously by humans for human benefit. And this would include animals like goats and sheep and things of that nature, but you don't get domestication of animals until you've really begun to get people that are starting to slow down and become sedentary and be in a certain location for long periods of time. Instead of being nomadic and following animals around, now people have irrigation, and they have places where they've invested a lot of labor and capital, social capital, not money. Money doesn't exist yet, but they've really put a lot of effort into irrigation and things of that nature, and domestication kind of follows along in lockstep of this process. It is very likely that the first animal to become domesticated was the dog, and you can see here in this cave painting there's a dog following along with this guy. I'm assuming that's a hunter of some kind. He's got a spear or something in his hand. But you have, ironically, with the dog, you have another animal that is relatively intelligent and is extremely adaptable and comes along with humans very easily when humans begin irrigation, agriculture, well, horticulture actually, and domestication of other animals, herd animals. In the process of domestication, irrigation, and figuring out horticulture takes a long time. And what it does, though, is it contributes to people staying in one place. And when you have property, in the general sense, property, not like you own a house or something like that, but when you have property, you don't or can't always move it around. If you had just a couple of goats or something, you could herd them to a different location and stay with them. But if you've got money and not money, but if you've got time and effort tied up in horticulture and you're growing some kind of a crop, you can't just walk away from that. You have to continue to stick around. Now, once you have property, you have inventory, and inventory means record keeping. And really, this is what drives the creation of written language. And you see cuneiform developed in Mesopotamia. And cuneiform is written on a clay tablet with a little reed stylus. And it's extremely simple language. Maybe not for us looking at it now, but they're able to convey ideas. And it is among the first written languages. It's cumbersome and inefficient, but it's still written language. In Egypt, at the exact same time, for a lot of the exact same reasons, you get the creation of another type of written language. This is hieroglyphics, and it works on a different principle, but it still is able to convey ideas, transmit thought, and the difference with Egyptians and the real genius of the Egyptian system is that they are able to create a crude type of paper out of reeds in the river, it's called papyrus. It's a basic paper. And that they also carve things into stone, but they could write things down more efficiently. And this ability to transmit ideas, and again, here we come back to that idea of imagination, is a fundamental building block. It's part of what allows society to develop. Written language and artistic expression are all great byproducts of this process of domestication and civilization building, but the biggest complication, and something we still deal with to this very day, of people becoming sedentary and suddenly having this property that they've tied up all this effort into, is when you have something, someone automatically almost always wants to come along and take it from you, and this leads to warfare, conflict. There's plenty of conflict in the fossil record before this. Humans have been murdering each other since the beginning of time, and this is no different in terms of people killing each other. The difference is that you now see organized warfare, and it elevates conflict and violence to an entirely new scale, where you have groups of people engaging in this activity, where it's not just small scale, one band of folks stealing something from another band of folks, but you have armed conflict that has a political purpose or has a social purpose. And because you've got the ability to feed more people, people are kind of coalescing into a certain location. People naturally tend to flock together, gather, and what you have is a transition from decentralized villages and little bands of people living together to a hierarchically organized city-state. And these develop massive monumental architecture, and power flows from the city. And these city-states form in different parts of Mesopotamia, and just by nature, these city-states are always at war with one another for one reason or another. And the first king to be powerful enough to unite all of Mesopotamia under his one rule was a man named Sargon. And this is a statue of him. This is Sargon I. And you can see that at some point in time, he was deposed and his statue was defaced. You can see someone has bashed out the eyes with some kind of implement, probably a chisel or a hammer or something like that, as a way of mocking his power. But Sargon is significant because he's the first one that is able to harness military power for political purposes, and this allows him to secure rule and bring about tremendous power to his specific city and put everything else under his economic domination. And a couple of hundred years later, in a different part of Mesopotamia, there is a Babylonian king. This would have been in what is modern-day Iraq again. And his name is Hammurabi. You've probably heard that name before as well. And the significance of Hammurabi is that he makes great changes to society. So instead of just being this kind of military despot that's running around conquering everything in sight for love of power and domination, he's actually thinking about society as a whole. And he establishes the first legal code called the Code of Hammurabi. He takes the step of quite literally carving this code right into stone. And then this stone with all of these legal codes on it is displayed in public. And at the very top of the stone, you can see there's Hammurabi sitting there, and he's quite literally handing out justice. Now, let's be very clear. This is not like a liberal, modern democracy with a Bill of Rights and things of that nature. This is an extremely brutal justice system with an eye for an eye type laws. But even though they're very brutal laws, this is still a clear attempt to codify behaviors. So it may be a ruthless kind of enforcement of law and order, but it is still an example of society becoming more than just the will of a couple of strong men, but actually having a code of ethics, if you will, for people to live their lives by. It's important to note that all of these city-states, all of these little areas in Mesopotamia that are growing during this time period, they're all polytheists, and that means that they believe in multiple gods. And the gods that they believed in basically looked a lot like us. And you can see from the figurines, the caricatures that they made to represent their gods, that they're essentially reflections of humans. So the gods kind of act like humans, the gods make mistakes, and in making mistakes they learn moral lessons, etc. And the gods of Mesopotamia also existed for these people in a more physical form. So not a spirit that was intangible but flesh, immortal but still a physical form. And each one of the gods was linked to a specific city. So you have Marduk linked with Babylon, Ishtar, before Marduk, different gods that meant different things, but still a very complicated polytheistic pantheon. And these religions that surrounded these gods were also quite brutal. And the cults that practiced worship for these gods often used child sacrifice, and these are stories that you can find just absolutely scandalize the folks in the Bible, and you can't read very much of the Old Testament without running across somebody being horrified that a sacrifice is being made to one of these kind of cruel Mesopotamian gods. And these gods have what's called ziggurats. A ziggurat is essentially a stepped pyramid, but this is still monumental architecture of these ancient civilizations. And it's a stepped pyramid, usually in 7 stages. This is not a tomb, so don't get confused when you hear the word pyramid. These structures, ziggurats, are strictly religious and probably symbolize man's upward connection to the divine, this great pantheon of all these different gods. Of all of the ancient civilizations, nothing has quite captured as much attention or historical nostalgia, if you will, as Egypt and the civilizations that grew there. Again, we see civilization growing around a river. This is the Nile River, and the Nile is actually extremely predictable. It has set patterns of when it floods and when it relaxes, and these environmental patterns allow people to predict when they're going to have the right conditions for growing crops or running water through their irrigation systems. You can see from the photograph here, the satellite photo rather, 90-something% of Egypt is just uninhabitable desert with no water in it. And so agriculture is what forms the base from which Egypt builds an empire. And the empire in Egypt, in different forms, basically lasts the better part of 2,000 years. But here we return again to this idea of the little ribbon of green that goes through a desert or inhospitable environment. And you can see all of the different cities that grew in the map on the left along the Nile from one end to the other. The civilization in Egypt starts in what is known as the Archaic period. And during the Archaic period, there's a series of small settlements, very tiny villages, very decentralized, spread around on either side of the Nile. And this is 3,200 years ago. Certainly the art and produced by this culture, it doesn't look like what you would envision Egyptian art looking like if you closed your eyes and thought about Egypt. You close your eyes and you think about Egypt, you see pyramids and fancy golden masks and things like that, and people that are in that weird stilted 2D kind of profile. This is much more abstract. But the folks in the Archaic period are beginning to get serious about farming and agriculture, and it's from this base that the kingdoms of Egypt can grow. During the Old Kingdom, the structures of Egyptian society become defined. And one of the biggest and certainly most influential ideas is this concept of what's called a pharaoh. And a pharaoh is basically the king. He's the emperor. Now, there is a sharp difference between Egypt and Mesopotamia in terms of king. For the Egyptians, Pharaoh is God, whereas, say, Sargon the First was just a man. He was a king, but he was not a god himself. Egypt evolves from proto-states at either end of the Nile into Upper and Lower Egypt. And when I say upper and lower, think backwards, because the Nile actually flows to the north. There's only one other major river on the planet that does that. That's the St. Johns River in Jacksonville, Florida. But Upper Egypt is actually south, and Lower Egypt is actually north, because everything is built around the river. The river is so important to the function of this civilization that north and south and direction doesn't play as big a role as nature in the form of the Nile River. The Egyptians are also polytheists. They have another extremely complicated pantheon of gods. These gods tend to be a mixed batch of kind of anthropomorphic combinations of animals and humans, and you get different versions of some of these gods with all manner of strange heads, crocodile heads, lion heads, bird parts, human parts, things like that. And these gods are linked with different concerns, moods of the people, moods of the universe, and they all play special roles in the maintenance of the universe as well. The first pharaoh to unite both parts of Egypt, Lower and Upper Egypt, is a guy named Narmer, and he was big into smiting people, as you can see from this painting. This is a very famous painting, actually. It was in National Geographic, and we only have this very poor sculptural representation of Narmer because we're going way back in time with him. But he's significant because he's the one that was powerful enough to use the military to join both parts of Egypt. This particular artifact is actually a makeup palette, and it's a little stone, and the makeup would have been put in the right hand side between the necks of the beast, and then you could use it to paint your eyes in the best ancient Egyptian fashion. But if you look closely at the left hand side, it's a record of victory for Narmer, and that engraving right there is almost the exact same image as you saw in that National Geographic painting. Again, here's Narmer smiting somebody, and this is a record of his victory over Lower Egypt. And sometimes history has a great sense of irony because Narmer may have been powerful enough to unite Upper and Lower Egypt, but he wasn't on the throne for very long. He is in fact killed by a hippo while he's out hunting, and it does. You would seem that think that a logical, rational, sober person would begin to call into question the idea of divine kings and Pharaoh being a god if he's gobbled up by a hippopotamus. But the institution of Pharaoh continues to live on even after Narmer's death. The Old Kingdom is also when the most well-known monuments of ancient Egypt are constructed, and specifically the Great Pyramid, but there's dozens of other pyramids all over Egypt, and most of the pyramids are step pyramids, which means if you view them in profile, it looks like a set of stairs almost going up to the top. They're not smooth-sided like the Great Pyramid, and none of these step pyramids come even close to the size and grandeur of the Great Pyramid. And what most people don't realize is that the Egyptian pyramids were actually built using alien technology. And there is plenty of evidence to support this if people will just wake up and accept what we all know to be the truth. And it's even possible that people's positive energy can be focused through these giant pyramids to create clean energy batteries. And I am, of course, making all of this up. There is a trend today to blame, or not, excuse me, not blame, but to credit visitors from outer space with building these monuments. And if you think about it in the historical sense, it's actually offensive. Because when you say that the aliens constructed these monuments, you're taking away the personal agency of these men and women of the past that constructed these things. It's almost like you're saying that the people of ancient Egypt were so stupid they couldn't possibly have done it. And the most logical explanation is that somebody from another planet came here and built them, rather than just accept the historical reality that while we may not be entirely in the know of exactly how they did it, it is absolutely clear that the people of ancient Egypt built these things, and they did it with engineering methods that would have been available to them at the time, copper tools, and just sheer brute force. And that doesn't make it less likely that they built the Great Pyramids. It just makes it all the more amazing that these structures were completed during the Old Kingdom. The pharaoh Khufu is responsible for the construction of the Great Pyramid. It's not likely he did much of the construction himself, but he was able to harness the manpower and economic resources to have the thing built. The Great Pyramid is the ultimate expression of power, and this is in a couple of ways. Not only is it just a gigantic monument, but it also has to be paid for, and we're talking paid for with just ridiculous amounts of gold, stupid amounts of gold, just for the construction of this. It's a tomb, it's a burial place. So you're really making quite the statement when you build one of these giant pyramids. And building pyramids is apparently a lot like eating potato chips, and once you've got one, you can't really stop. And so there are also two more, although they're smaller pyramids constructed right next to the big one. And there's many smaller step pyramids for queens and court officials around the bases of the three larger ones. And Egyptians are essentially obsessed with their own mortality, and this leads to this building of such monumental tombs. The two smaller pyramids are built by Khufu's sons, Khafre and Menkaure. The Old Kingdom eventually begins to break down under environmental strain and the strain of having to build these gigantic monuments, and also warfare with neighboring Mesopotamian states. And when the Old Kingdom begins to break down, it takes a while for society to sort its problems out, get everything back on track, and when the civilization begins to become more stable, we call this period the Middle Kingdom. And the Middle Kingdom has some very specific features. The first among these features is the creation of mummies. And prior to the Middle Kingdom, mummification was something that was for the nobility because it was expensive, it was out of the reach of most people. Um, in the Middle Kingdom, mummification is not just for the nobility, but it's actually available to everyone. So these ideas of the afterlife and what happens after death have filtered down from the Old Kingdom into the Middle Kingdom, um, almost in a democratic way, because mummification is now open to a much greater audience. There are actually several different types of or methods by which somebody can become a mummy. There's natural and unnatural methods. Essentially, when you create a mummy, you remove water. At least that's a major part of it. Now, you can do that through extremely dry air, like the Peruvian mummy up there on the top left, being frozen in ice, like the Iceman on the top right, or the bog body on the bottom right, which is in a bog. It's an anaerobic environment. There's no oxygen to attack tissues. And then there's, of course, hot sand and dry environment like the one on the bottom left, and that's an Egyptian mummy as well. So not everyone does this, but it's practical in Egypt. It's easier to do because they've got access to the materials they need and it's the proper environment. So it goes along quite nicely with this whole idea of the body going into the afterlife. You've heard of Egyptian embalming and mummy making before. I'm absolutely certain of it. But this is not the same kind of process that we have in our modern society. So the modern idea of embalming actually starts during the American Civil War, and it involves the insertion of what's called a trocar into an artery, a main blood vessel, and you drain out fluids and you replace it with a stabilizing agent, and it's cosmetic. It's about keeping the body intact long enough to get it uh, into the ground, basically. You want to be able to move a dead soldier from the battlefield in the 1860s back to his hometown on the other side of the United States by train in a time period when there's no refrigeration. It's about it's a more cosmetic process, and it's focused on making the body look good, not necessarily preserving it forever. And on the flip side of that, the Egyptian idea is maintenance of the body, longevity of the body. And the Egyptian process is extremely complicated. Every step of the process is ritualized and has social significance. It's not just a or scientific and clinical process like it is in the modern type of embalming. And the fact that it is such a ritualized, complicated process just reflects this whole obsession that the Egyptians had with death, not only with death, but with the life after death. Rather than fixing organs in place and switching out fluids, etc., etc., some of the organs in the Egyptian process are removed. They're stored in jars. These are called canopic jars, and these jars traveled with the corpse, the mummy, as it was being created. And each one has got incantations carved on the front, um, and each one held a different type of organ for a different specific purpose. It's an extremely, the reason that I show you these jars is to emphasize, drive home the point, that this is an extremely complicated, drawn out religious procession that circles this whole practice of embalming in ancient Egypt. As regular folks begin to be mummified and have access to this, well, it is kind of technology, this technology of mummification, they're not buried in structures like the old kingdom. They're buried in what's called a mastaba, and it's kind of like a giant table made out of bricks. No one, not even Pharaoh, can afford to build a pyramid by this time in Egyptian history. And so burial practices in terms of the architecture, the grand architecture, is becoming much more simplified, while the religious and cultural practices surrounding mummification are actually getting more complicated. This period in the Middle Kingdom is a time period of extremely aggressive expansion. And this pharaoh, Thutmose III, expands Egypt from Nubia, which is actually far south of Egypt, all the way to what is modern-day Israel on the Mediterranean coast. And he has minimal conflict with um, some of the Mesopotamian states, and he has access to a whole series of new military developments, compound bow and brand new copper weapons, and he's able to harness this military technology to expand the borders of Egypt. Despite the military power and expansion seen during the Middle Kingdom, there is an invasion by a people known as the Hyksos, and they sweep through Egypt, and they are able to completely topple um, everything that has been built in the Middle Kingdom in terms of Egyptian society. And this is an extremely violent invasion. You can see here this severed head. There's an axe hole in the forehead. Obviously, that's what killed the guy. And the conflict, this Hyksos invasion, disrupts not only Egypt but also Mesopotamia as well. It results in another time period, much like we saw between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, where you've got this period of instability and weakening of social structures. It eventually sorts itself out, and you end up with what is called, no surprise, the New Kingdom. In the New Kingdom, we see a new era of peace in Egypt. There's also a strange, dubious flirtation with new cultural ideas, especially new ideas about religion. And the ideas that come out of the New Kingdom about religion are especially significant. The great-great-grandson of Thutmose III is a man named Amenhotep IV. And Amenhotep, for some reason, decides to completely overhaul religion in Egypt. He creates a monotheistic religion centered in a place called Amarna, abandons the former religious capital, and moves everything to Amarna. And when he does this, he changes his name. He stops being called Amenhotep and goes to the name Akhenaten, which means it's a has religious significance because his monotheistic religion is built around worship of the sun. And the Aten is the sun, the actual physical disk of the sun. And you see it here in this little sliver of rock where a sphinx is basking in the sun's rays, and that sun is the Aten. And that becomes the single subject of worship for these people, and hence we have monotheism for the first time. This is a chopped out piece of an old temple, and again you can see the rays of the Aten, and the queen is worshiping here, surrounded by the rays coming out of the sun disk. And here you will only have one god. And the way this religion worked was there was only one god, the Aten, and people would worship Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh would worship the Aten. And of course, the nobility and the priests who've have an extensive and very well developed social system based upon religion and the afterlife and this gigantic pantheon of all of these anthropomorphic gods, they hate the idea of this monotheism. And it pits Akhenaten and the royal family against the nobility and the priests. And the priests have a tremendous amount of power, social power. He also invents what's called the Amarna style, and it's a total change in the style of representing people in sculpture and carving and artwork to frankly, a strange, rounded, bug-eyed, pot-bellied kind of art. And you can see it in the sculpture, with the little pot belly hanging out, the weird shape of the head, and then the image of the king and queen holding the two babies with the elongated heads on the right-hand side. And that image on the right-hand side is Akhenaten with Queen Nefertiti and their sons. And this is another one of those places where people point to this as evidence of alien contact with society. Surely no human being could come up with the idea of changing art all on their own. They had to be influenced by aliens. It's just preposterous. This is the other painting. It's from a tomb wall. It shows the elongated heads and the strange bodily proportions. And this is the other one that's pointed to most of the time as evidence of ancient aliens. And again, I caution you to be careful of these wild theories, because it degrades what we know about people from the past. It suggests that people are incapable of innovation and creation in their own terms for their own reasons, and the simple fact of the matter that for some reason he decides to overhaul religion is a fascinating story to be looked at. When you stop looking at his reasons and the history of what he did and just begin to look at this as, oh, look, aliens did something new, it becomes an erosion of history. And we want to try and avoid that as much as possible. We want to understand history in its own context, not to bring all of our modern weird baggage back into the past and dump it on top of these people. All of the changes made by Akhenaten didn't last. When he's dead, his son becomes pharaoh, and his son is famous. It's Tutankhamun. He's has the golden mask, and when you close your eyes and think of the treasures of ancient Egypt, this should be what floats in front of your mind. And Tutankhamun immediately reversed the monotheism and went so far as to chop up into little blocks, like you saw on the previous slide, the temples for the Aten disk, and did everything that he could do to erase the memory of monotheism as an experiment. So it may have been stomped out and may have been just kind of a brief monotheistic experiment, but it's still the first time we see monotheism in history. Also, in this time period, you no longer see burials with gigantic mastabas or pyramids. And the reason for this is finally somebody wised up and realized that basically when you build a giant pyramid and you bury yourself with all of your gold and riches inside it, you're essentially putting up a giant billboard that says, hey, looters, come dig me up and steal everything out of my tomb. And the nobility begins to be buried in nondescript places, essentially holes in the ground, tombs that are carved out of the rock instead of being built by brick, and they're hidden. And because they're hidden, we actually end up with quite a few of the royal mummies from this time period, because they weren't looted and they weren't destroyed like everything from the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. This is actually what Tutankhamun looks like today. He has been reburied in his tomb where they found him, although all of the gold and everything else that they discovered when they opened up the tomb has been carted off to a museum in Cairo. And periodically they'll take parts of his collection and tour it around the world to major museums. And on the left-hand side is one of the painted figures supposedly depicting what he looked like when he was alive. And generally speaking, that mummy is still in pretty good shape. One enduring mystery about this particular family is we haven't quite figured out exactly who Tutankhamun's mother is. At first, we thought that the mummy on the left, which was given the name Kaya, was his mother, but it was in such an excellent state of preservation that they were able to do DNA testing, and that is not the case. The second and most likely theory is that Queen Nefertiti was actually his mother, but we have not been able to find her mummy anywhere. We have almost all of the rest of the royal families from this time period, but her mummy is missing and would potentially provide the DNA evidence to fully draw in all of the family tree, but we just haven't quite located all of the family members yet. Although there's no building of pyramids, there's still epic architecture being created during this time period. No one else built more than Ramses II. He built gigantic tombs, underground, of course, temples, forts, administrative buildings, um, and he built on a monumental scale, statues hundreds of feet high. Um, but despite the fact that he built these huge temples and things like that, there's never been a temple found with a span between columns of more than 12 feet. So it actually tells you that the engineering necessary to create a lot of these buildings and temples is that much more impressive because they had to lift stone blocks every 12 feet, and some of these temples are hundreds of feet um, across. I have actually seen this mummy, and the state of preservation of Ramses II is amazing. You can see he's got red hair that is still clinging to parts of the scalp. It's actually just amazing how well preserved this particular mummy is. Ramses II was a great military general as well, and fought many campaigns with other Mesopotamian people. And his largest campaign ended with a peace treaty between Egypt and the Hittites. And we know this because we actually have tablets which record in cuneiform step-by-step accounts of the treaty signing and the military campaign. And these cuneiform tablets are in a museum. Now, if you look at the picture here, you can see that Ramses is riding kind of triumphantly in his chariot, etc., etc. And the engravings on the tomb walls and temple buildings about this conflict that Ramses built claim that he won and defeated the Hittites, and the cuneiform tablets claim that they won and defeated Ramses and were benevolent enough to sign a peace treaty with him. So it's interesting because you have this written record in two different cultures going back and forth, each one putting the other one to shame. And what brings this entire story to a close is something called the invasion of the Sea Peoples. And there are many unanswered questions about this. We really do not have a clue as to who they were, where they were from, just that they were conquerors, and they were responsible for wiping out the ancient civilizations. And not just Egypt, but Mesopotamia as well. And when these ancient civilizations get destroyed, it's not as if people cease to exist, but the social structures that have been, especially in Egypt, around for 2,000 years, have to rebuild themselves. And what happens is these civilizations have been ripped apart and cast down, but humans rebuild these societies, restart, and morph into all new and all different types of societies. And we'll talk more about that next time.